This is a response to an interview Jonathan McIntosh did a while back about video games and feminist frequency.
Well, first of all, I think it's extremely important to take gaming seriously. Games are an enormous cultural influence.
Since I started reviewing Anita's work, given what I've seen over the last year and a half, I'd say both sides take gaming too seriously, and you said at the start of this that you take gaming serious. Gaming may be a cultural influence, but some of the arguments you make that I take issue with are your heavy implications that these games are harmful.
It's a multi-billion-dollar industry with a staggering number of players, and as such, it holds a pretty profound sway in our popular culture, and so it's very important, I think, to look at that medium critically, to take it seriously, and to really try to examine the messages and values that these interactive experiences are putting out in the world.
Again, you emphasize how important it is to you to be critical of gaming. As far as examining the messages and values from these games, the burden of proof is on you to prove these are harmful. And a lot of your rhetoric outside of this interview implies these games will have some significant change on society if only they design them the way you think they should be designed. It sounds more like a faith-based rather than a fact-based system.
A lot of the work that you do in at Feminist Frequency, particularly with the Tropes vs. Women in Video Game series, focuses on tropes that are damaging or misrepresent the female experience. And where are you seeing the worst perpetuation of damaging tropes in games?
So part of what Feminist Frequency tries to do in this video series, Tropes versus Women, is to look at overarching patterns that have existed throughout the history of the medium and have existed and still exist like across genre.
Most of these tropes predate video games, Jonathan. Anita said so in Damsel in Distress Part 1.
Of course, the damsel in distress predates the invention of video games by several thousand years. The trope can be traced back to ancient Greek mythology with the tale of Perseus.
It predates games by thousands of years and exists in almost every form of storytelling. Most people don't view this trope as a serious issue. It's people like you that define it as an issue with manipulative language.
So while certainly there are some really, really egregious examples, and everyone likes to talk about those, I actually think that it's far more damaging to see how some of these patterns and tropes are repeated.
You can find egregious examples of almost anything in existence. That doesn't make it inherently bad. You are defining it that way. You also said you thought it's damaging how these patterns are repeated. How is it damaging? I'm still waiting for you to prove this stuff is more harmful than your manipulative language implies.
And are there any tropes that spring to mind that come up that are particularly troublesome?
Yeah, I mean, so the Tropes versus Women series focuses on a number of gender stereotypes, a number of tropes that have very sort of regressive messages about gender, and specifically about the roles of women.
Regressive messages? Since you're about to talk about the damsel in distress, by the time this is over, we'll see whose message is regressive.
So one example is the damsel in distress, right, which is like one of the most popular video game tropes. So we've cataloged about 550 examples over the years of that trope, and that's just, I think, scratching the surface in many ways.
Just scratching the surface? Anita said this in her first Damsel in Distress video.
This project will examine the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
When Anita first said systemic, big-picture perspective, you didn't have anywhere near 550 examples documented. According to what I found, you didn't even start documenting the damsel in distress trope on a website till almost half a year after Anita's Kickstarter ended, and not till after her videos were supposed to be done by the end of 2012. All you did was grab the bare minimum to make your arguments. And you don't even document the Ms. Male character or background decoration tropes, just the damsel. You do the bare minimum and try to convince us with arguments instead of evidence. Your research is lazy.
So obviously you have a disempowered female character who is made the goal of a male character, right? They have to go rescue her.
There is nothing inherently wrong with that if you fail to prove this is harmful. But let's take you at face value and assume it is. After all 3 damsel in distress videos, I've concluded one of the only variations of this trope that you consider acceptable is a situation where the female has to assist in her own escape if she's captured. That completely eliminates any storytelling element where you rescue a girl who can't rescue herself. Some of the games on your damsel list literally say various women. Even the most obscure, unimportant side character in a game who you forget about 5 minutes after you rescue them is unacceptable.
There's another trope which is called the woman in the refrigerator, which is where a female character is brutalized or killed specifically to motivate the male hero to then go on a personal revenge quest.
That's from Damsel in Distress Part 2, where you combine different tropes.
So we've seen developers try to spice up the damsel in distress cliché by combining it with other tropes that involve victimized women. I've identified a few of the most common of these trope cocktails, which join together multiple regressive or negative representations of women, including the disposable woman, the mercy killing, and the woman in the refrigerator.
That makes the damsel in distress sound like a terrible thing to use in storytelling. So then you might wonder, what about the heroic rescue or the smooch of victory? There's nothing inherently wrong with a heroic rescue or receiving a kiss for rescuing someone.
Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory.
But then McIntosh would say those aren't part of the trope itself.
However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself.
This is how McIntosh manipulates things to make them look worse than they really are. He'll say the heroic rescue isn't part of the trope itself, but then combine the damsel in distress with other tropes, such as the woman in refrigerator. He does whatever it takes to make it look as bad as possible. Now the damsel in distress trope looks worse than it actually is.
In fact, there's a game called Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, which is the brand new Lord of the Rings game. And in the very beginning of that game, the hero's wife is brutally murdered in front of him, which then spurs him on to the rest of his quest.
Pretty confronting, really. Tolkien would be spinning in his grave.
Yeah, probably.
I don't know if Tolkien would be spinning in his grave, but I'm not sure. Lots of books have messed up things happening in them. And McIntosh doesn't even talk about how any of the other women are represented in this game. I think you have to look at more than one female character to give a fair assessment on a game and its overall representation of women.
Now, the series has received a lot of acclaim, but there's also been a lot of hate mail and death threats and attacks directed towards the team. Why do you think feminist frequency videos are received with such vitriol by some gamers?
I'm saving McIntosh's response to that for the end of this video, but I'll say that Anita's videos have spawned supporters that themselves have vitriol to games. A recent example would be how one of Anita's supporters wrote an article calling Nintendo's decision to make Linkle problematic because it's a Ms. character, despite the overwhelming support and praise Nintendo got for making a female Link. The article I'm referencing also complained about Nintendo's lack of a female Link in the core franchise and said something along the lines of, "It's 2016 and we're still putting up with this bullshit." If McIntosh wants to keep railing on how straight male gamers take their games too serious, he also needs to talk to the people who support his videos. Some of them take this video game stuff too serious.
On that topic of a paradigm shift in gaming that you just mentioned, this myth that games have been an almost exclusively male-dominated hobby is dying really quickly. So why is it that they're able to dictate trends in development in the way that they are now?
There has been a trend among publishers and developers to cater to a very small demographic, or increasingly shrinking demographic of straight white young men. But that's changing.
It isn't necessarily shrinking. Just because you see an increase in diversity doesn't mean your core demographic is disappearing. Just because a bunch of gaming websites simultaneously declared gamers over and leveled what looked like a hate campaign against straight white male gamers, that doesn't mean they're going away.
I think that also publishers and developers haven't quite caught on that their audience has shifted.
You ideologues are telling game developers things are shifting by saying that a demographic is disappearing, the end of an identity, gamers are over, but developers know better than that. Game developers know better than to blindly believe the nonsense mainstream gaming websites are spewing. Game developers know their core demographic is not disappearing.
And that the interest is now coming from a much broader base.
Great. Interest is coming from a broader base. That doesn't mean the entire industry needs to change. Anita said herself that despite the rise in independent developers, they still do the same stuff mainstream studios are doing.
Over the past several years, we've seen an explosion of independent development, with many new titles drawing inspiration from classic-era games. This is an exciting and vibrant trend with enormous potential for innovation. But have games produced outside of the mainstream studio system managed to break the gender mold and avoid damseling? Well, we see the trope reproduced in indie, mobile, or retro-inspired games.
Even with an explosion in independent development, they draw inspiration from classic games. They even use the same tropes. People still want to make games this way, and people still want to play these games. It is people like you that keep trying to define this as a problem.
And if I could bring you to something a bit lighter, what are some of the areas in which you've seen the most improvement in gender representation recently?
There has been an enormous shift in the way games are talked about, really over the past 2 or 3 years. Certainly women have been writing critically about games and gender in games for a long time, but over the past 2 or 3 years, it's become more common.
It's only become more common because of your videos. And your videos create extreme-minded people who are almost as bad as the straight male gamers you complain about so much.
And this conversation about the roles and representations of women in games has reached a critical mass.
This critical mass that was reached was in large part people having enough with this ideological nonsense.
And so, we are seeing many more voices heard in the games press and in games criticism. And then in terms of the reflection in the games themselves, it's still sadly quite rare to have a female lead in a game who is not hypersexualized. There have been, over the past, say, 5 years, some really stellar examples. I mean, the Portal series, Portal 2 was a brilliant game. Mirror's Edge came out a while ago and also quite brilliant. So there seems to be some momentum in that direction. And I also think that indie games in particular have opened up a whole range of possibilities in terms of representations of women.
You know what, Jonathan? They changed Lara Croft in Tomb Raider and made her well-written. You'd think that would be enough, but according to a Tomb Raider review on Feminist Frequency, there was issues with violence. It wasn't framed tragic enough. It didn't have enough of an emotional impact on the character. With people like you, it will never be good enough until it conforms to this perfect little checklist. And you give these types of analysis to several AAA games that come out where violence is the primary form of engagement. This is part of why critical mass has been reached. People are tired of it.
So there's an indie game called Gone Home, which is an excellent example. Not only does it have a female lead character, but it also is a female-centered story. So, I would say that Gone Home is a great example of a game that it really is trying to do something different and push the industry and gaming forward.
Gone Home may have done something different, but it's really difficult to say that it'll push the industry forward. A game came out recently called Sunset that barely sold any copies. It was a flop that left the developers frustrated. They said it was a small group of people that convinced them it would sell, but it didn't. Those developers tried to go in the direction people like you are telling them to, and all it amounted to was a big fat waste of their time. People like you try to concern developers more with identity politics and ideological game mechanics instead of just making fun games.
Lastly, the work that you and Anita do at Feminist Frequency focuses largely on the way stereotypes and tropes reflect women and represent women in games. But would you think that the tropes that inform male characters and the stereotypes of male characters necessarily represent a realistic or constructive depiction of men for audiences?
There certainly is, I think, a need to critically examine the way that men are represented, specifically in terms of a very sort of toxic, violent form of masculinity.
Your critique relies heavily on how these games reinforce regressive notions. Now that you are talking about violence in video games, your argument isn't as strong. Even if you view this form of masculinity as toxic, it's on you to prove these games are harmful. Why should game developers and players sacrifice gameplay mechanics they enjoy when you can't necessarily prove it is actually harmful?
The differences in the portrayals of men and women is that, women are portrayed as sex objects, as goals to be won, and those representations are designed for men. The representations of men are power fantasies. It's equating being a man with being violent, and I do think that there's some really toxic stuff going on there.
Thanks very much for joining us, Jonathan.
No problem at all.
It's really hard for me to buy into these male power fantasies being harmful. You think all these supposedly toxic representations should disappear, yet claim you don't want to take our games away. While you technically can't take them away, your criticism is rather harsh. All violence should be framed as tragic. Violence as a primary form of engagement is problematic. Don't use violence in particular circumstances if it reinforces a trope. How is every game developer in the industry supposed to conform to this checklist while making fun games and enjoying their jobs? Not only do you want to suck the fun out of it for players, but you also want to suck the fun out of it for game developers. Now for that section I was saving. This is sort of between me and McIntosh, so I don't expect it to be anything most of you would understand or be interested in.
I think that there's a group of male gamers out there, quite a large group, who see gaming as something that belongs to them. They see it as something that they're entitled to, that these gaming experiences should be for them and them alone.
What your rhetoric implies is that you actually want to see certain game design choices disappear. You want to do away with certain tropes. You don't want violence to ever be framed any other way than what you consider acceptable. It's not that we feel entitled to these game experiences as anyone can play these games. It's that we are telling you we still want our games and you keep telling us they are harmful. We keep telling you we want to play games with certain design choices and game mechanics, yet you keep telling us we shouldn't want those games. And then you blame the backlash on an entitlement mentality instead of considering your suggestions are extreme or unreasonable.
And the idea that these gaming experiences are being critiqued, are being analyzed, and are changing. I mean, there is a transformation going on. There's a paradigm shift going on within gaming to make it more inclusive. And I think that there's a number of male gamers who are terrified of that change. They're terrified of not being catered to exclusively. They're terrified of a more diverse gaming experiences because and that will change the face of games. It's becoming something that is a medium to tell all kinds of stories, not just the ones that they're used to.
Terrified of critiques, paradigm shifts, and more diverse experiences? People have been calling you and Anita out on your nonsense since day one. That has nothing to do with being terrified, but since you claim all these straight male gamers are terrified, I have some questions for you, McIntosh. Are you terrified of my critique? The reason I ask is because when I first started making videos last year, this was your profile pic on Twitter for the longest time. One day, I went off on you on Twitter. I didn't tweet directly at you, but I did criticize you quite a bit. That same day, after my rant, you changed your profile picture to this. See how in your earlier picture how smug you look, but in the second picture, you don't look as happy? Are you afraid of someone explaining what kind of person you really are and how you treat those around you? Are you terrified of me, McIntosh? I've also noticed a paradigm shift in feminist frequency. Going to the About section, looking at Team, I see this picture of Anita. I don't think this was the original picture here. Notice how Anita is smiling. She isn't wearing some boring clothes. Her hair is down. Going to your section, I noticed you currently have no picture, but you used to have one some time back. It's like things started changing at feminist frequency. Are you terrified of change, Jonathan? What about how in Anita's newer videos she changed? She ditched the plaid shirt in her positive female representations. Her hair is down. Her complexion seems different. You weren't even credited as a writer in the positive female character videos. Does this stray too far from the game plan? Are you terrified of change? How about how Anita said a few months ago that you were not the puppet master? She publicly stated you are merely the hired help. Despite a quick rise in the ranks at Feminist Frequency and how closely you are involved with it, including producing your own content on the Feminist Frequency YouTube channel, you are at the end of the day just the hired help. For a short while after that, your Twitter profile pic was this. This image just looks so depressing. After a few days, you change your profile pic to this. Just plain old McIntosh. No smug look, no grin, just a plain look on your face. And your Twitter background. If I remember right, there was some picture of Batman for the longest time with what looked like some people in front of him. Now it's this image of a guy who looks like he crash-landed on a planet, just sitting under a tree all alone. It looks so depressing. Are you terrified of not being catered to exclusively by Anita? Anita recently defended her work publicly. She actually responded to one of Thunderfoot's criticisms, which Anita rarely, if ever, did before. She streamed on Twitch. She interacted with her live audience, which she rarely does. She's even posting video game reviews on her YouTube channel. It's so unusual for her to go off script like that. Are you terrified of the more diverse experience Anita's supporters are receiving from Anita? There has been so much change over at Feminist Frequency over the last year. A lot of these are little changes most people wouldn't notice, but I notice them. Feminist Frequency is becoming a medium to tell all sorts of narratives, not just the ones you are spinning. Even if I don't agree with Anita on everything, at least it's something different from the routine. Are you terrified that you are losing control? Are you terrified that everything isn't going exactly as you planned it out? Are you terrified of me, Jonathan McIntosh?